Hello, my name is Ian Andersen and I work for the European Commission's Interpreting Service, and I'm here today with Matthew Perret. Matthew.
Hello, my name's Matthew Perret and I'm a freelance interpreter working mainly for the EU institutions. I also train interpreters from time to time, and I also write and perform comedy, which I suspect is why Jan has inveigled me into sitting here in a booth outside working hours to talk to him.
Perish the thought. No. But now that you mention it, you do stand-up comedy, and I've actually seen some of your work, which I find completely exhilarating. And I was just wondering, as an interpreter who has become a stand-up comedy, how do you see the connection between the two?
Well, the first thing I'd say, I guess, is that comedy is a very serious business, and it took quite some time, really, to break into, but also to turn off some of impulses impulses in the booth. So I was already doing student drama and shows at the Edinburgh Festival and so on before I became an interpreter. And when I became an interpreter, you used the word exhilarating just now. I found interpreting work absolutely exhilarating because it was about people, talking to people, having an effect on people, sometimes even making people laugh. And quite quickly I realised what the limitations were upon that obviously you have to be faithful to the intention of the speaker. So if you have a wonderful speaker, there are certain things that you can let yourself go with, but your own ego and your own desire to entertain and to be liked is not really relevant in the booth and can get in the way of you doing a good job of communicating somebody else's message. And I think a lot of interpreters feel that, because I think to be an interpreter you have to be an instinctive communicator, have to have lots of these skills, and then there's this paradox that some of the time you have to turn off some of the skills in order to get on with the nuts and bolts of the work. And I think some of us are left craving for that moment of being able to say, this is me with my message, having some fun with an audience without a script that I'm constantly hearing in my ears in another language.
Now, when I look at stand-up, I think it must be the single most courageous act of human endeavour. You get up, I wouldn't say completely naked, but in a sense you are naked in front of an audience, sometimes of hundreds, even thousands, and you have to deliver something to entertain them, or they will flay you alive basically after the show and want their money back. Whereas as an interpreter, you have this protection in most cases of working behind glass, and even if the audience does want to pelt you with tomatoes and other missiles, you're protected.
They bounce off, that's right. Yeah.
How do you live that difference in, shall we say, exposure that you have as a comic as opposed to an interpreter?
Well, I think if you ever do consecutive, that's a good kind of halfway house, if you like, because you're standing up in front of people and you have that physical connection. You don't have the protection of the glass, you have the eye contact, and quite often in after dinner speeches and things like that, you also have that sort of slightly more informal connection. There's something about the way in which communication works that can be a lot more direct. So in that sense there's a similarity. Certainly the glass partition can seem like a protection, but one thing I think I've felt, having done away with it on several occasions, as you describe, and got on stage without that protection, is that you then realise when you go back into the booth that sometimes it's an illusion. It's a psychological protection, because you think people can't throw tomatoes at you, and obviously the tomatoes themselves will bounce off the glass, but people are still making judgments about your work and what you're saying. And in a way, you are exposed. You just walk away from it afterwards. You don't get the heckling, you don't get the feedback necessarily. And I found that quite useful to me as an interpreter and as a trainer to undergo that experience that, you know, can be an awful one, but of people coming back to you and telling you exactly what they've made of what you were saying and whether you were succeeding in getting something across, moving people to laughter in the case of comedy. But having that two-way discussion with the audience is quite illuminating, I think, and quite useful to an interpreter too.
Now, you said as an interpreter you have constantly the script in your ear in another language, but supposedly as a comic, as a comedian, as an actor, somewhere there is also a script, although I would imagine that you would react to audience comment in many cases, but how do you mediate this contradiction between having a set script as an interpreter as opposed to a more fluid script as a comic, and do you sometimes feel perhaps tempted to ad-lib a little bit as an interpreter, or is that the tendency you have to hold down?
Well, I think it's a good outlet for it to do performance, as I was hinting earlier, and I think I've got a grip on my desire to ad-lib by just channeling it into a completely different place. And I think there are also some paradoxes at play here too, because whilst there is a script for you as an interpreter, it's ideas and concepts rather than actual forms of words. And as a stand-up, the form of words, the rhythm of the speech, the phraseology is absolutely vital, and you tinker with it at your peril when you've got it right, when you've found the timing and the intonation that works for a joke. You don't play around with it, whereas an interpreter, I think, is constantly playing around with the phraseology and the intonation in an attempt to get closer to the heart of the meaning of what the speaker is saying, which you don't always know in advance, so you're sometimes having to change direction as you go along, as you're speaking as an interpreter. So in some ways, the interpreter is freer and more dynamic than the comedy performer on stage.
Now, how do you find the, shall we say, relative lack of immediate audience feedback as an interpreter, where you would often be in meetings where people are so engrossed in the actual business that they would only notice the interpretation when it really doesn't work, as opposed to being on stage and you have the direct live feedback from the audience where you have an immediate thermometer of how is this working?
Yes, I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, obviously I enjoy both, otherwise I wouldn't be doing both, and I very much enjoy what you describe as a thermometer, getting this response. And as you also said earlier, that can then determine where you go next. So depending on the response, you can go off in a different direction. That can stimulate something totally new. Or conversely, if you're in trouble, if you're having a really tough night, you're going to keep constantly working away at that audience until you find the way in, the way to bring them round to how you're looking at things. So that's stimulating and also sometimes daunting. And as an interpreter, you have the protection of the knowledge that you can only do your best with the materials that you're given. But I think also you might end up with a frustration at the lack of human response, and I know some interpreters like to go and talk to delegates, make sure things were clear. In consecutive and in whispering and sometimes on mission, you have a much closer relationship than when you're in a huge meeting room behind glass. And I think some interpreters do suffer from that and would like to have more contact with delegates, and it would probably be beneficial for all of us to have a bit more contact so that we are closer to our customers' needs, more attuned to what they want, but not in the sense of the ego trip. And I sense there's probably another kind of frustration, which is that we all like to get a pat on the back. We all like to know that things are going well. And as an interpreter, sometimes you feel things have gone well, but you're also protected from the bouquets of flowers that could otherwise be sort of heading towards the booth. They're also bouncing off the glass, and you walk home on your own, just wondering whether you did actually do a good job or not, because nobody's patted you on the back. So that can, I think, be part of the isolation that some interpreters feel.
We once interviewed an interpreting user and asked him, what did he think of the quality of interpretation? I said, well, there are basically two kinds. There are those, you have speakers that go on and on and on and on, are incredibly boring, and the interpreter brings them to life, gesticulates that bring out the message, and everybody rejoices in the quality of the interpretation much better than the original speaker. Or you'd see original speakers moving their hands and bringing the audience into the very heart of their political thought. And the interpreter just goes on and on and on and sounds like Leonard Cohen without the guitar. And I just wonder, how do you feel as an interpreter in bringing your material to life if you're dealing with speakers whose energy is perhaps not making you do your best? How do you deal with that situation?
What I would try to focus on is where they're coming from, what their intention is. So even if their energy is lacking, if there is a message there that you can somehow dig out, then you can communicate that message effectively. You can be a good communicator. The really soul-destroying thing, I think, is when you can't really dig out any sort of message, or when you feel that somebody is deliberately trying not to be communicative, which can happen occasionally, and that then puts us in a difficult position when we do need all the protection we can get to just say, I'm just the voice of that other voice. I can't do any more than that.
Have you ever faced what must be the stand-up comic's nightmare, the completely unresponsive audience?
Yes. Yes, I'd definitely be lying if I pretended that hadn't happened. And I did a free show on the Edinburgh Fringe last year, which was great because it meant people would come in because they were curious. They didn't have to invest in a ticket first. So I had nice sort of big houses of audience. But it meant that sometimes some people had just wandered in to get out of the rain. And I once had a 10-year-old boy in the front row, just as I was about to start a show which was attempting to take a light-hearted look at the institutional structure of the EU, said to me, "Is it a magic show?" Of course, you know, in some ways maybe he was right, but you know, yes, you are sometimes condemned to disappoint people's expectations.
Now you started your interpreting career actually on stage, if I may put it that way, in the sense that you were acting and performing before performing in a glass cage in the EU institutions. For people who are contemplating becoming interpreters at a tender age, would you recommend that they do some stage work before joining the profession?
Not necessarily stage work, but I think using your voice, being a public speaker, trying to get something across to an audience and observing how people respond to different ways of speaking, how you evoke responses in the audience and how you get ideas across clearly is really, really useful. And I think quite often interpreters tend to be so focused on language that they get caught up in terminology. And obviously you need the right terminology, especially if it's a technical topic. But I think linguists quite often become fixated on words. And if there's any way of getting away from that and actually enjoying the communication process in itself, I think that's a great preparation for a career as an interpreter.
Thank you very much for showing up today, Matthew.
My pleasure.